Luang Pu Mun. It was during the rains retreat at Wat Khao Wongkot that Luang Por first heard the name of the monk who was to become a legendary figure in Thailand, the most revered monk of his generation. Today, on the shrines of houses, shops and offices throughout Isan, a photograph of Luang Pu Mun can commonly be seen in a place of honor just below that of the Buddha himself. The most common of these photographs reveals a slight figure dressed in the somber robes of the forest monk, standing with an almost ghost-like stillness amongst unearthly trees, his hands clasped in front of him, radiating an austere composure. He seems to be looking right through the camera and straight into the viewer's heart. It's an inspiring but discomfiting picture. It challenges all that the viewer takes for granted. The stories and anecdotes featuring Luang Pu Mun, related by his students and contemporaries, are startlingly reminiscent of the accounts of great monks found in the Buddhist scriptures. Although a certain amount of hyperbole may be expected from such sources, the comparisons are not fanciful. Luang Pu Mun was an exemplary forest monk who was so devoted to the ascetic, peripatetic way of life that for a period of over 50 years he did not spend 2 consecutive rains retreats in the same monastery. It was only at the very end of his life, when he could no longer walk, that he gave up his daily alms round. His psychic powers were by all accounts stupendous, and the sharpness and penetration of his reflective powers breathtaking. For many Thai Buddhists, Luang Pu Mun represents an utterly convincing proof that enlightenment exists and is attainable in this day and age. Forest monks have never been absent from Thailand, but before Luang Pu Mun, they were usually scattered in small, isolated communities that possessed little sense of being part of a wider tradition. These sanghas tended to be centered around a charismatic teacher and rarely lasted long after his death. There are no records to tell us how many such groups have assembled and dispersed in the last 700 years. We will never know how many enlightened beings have come and gone. In the words of the Buddha himself, like birds crossing the sky, they leave no tracks. Luang Pu Mun, however, lived at the beginning of a more informed and connected age. Accounts of his practice and teachings have been recorded in a large number of books. Many fine training monasteries, which attract visitors and pilgrims from all over the country, have been established by his disciples throughout Isan. He may be an unfathomable figure to many, but he is not obscure in the way that great monks of an earlier generation will always remain. The high standards maintained by the monks of his lineage and the integrity and prowess of his greatest disciples have ensured that today there is a respect for forest monks that has not existed in the country since the Sukhothai period. It would be no exaggeration to say that the Thai forest tradition as we know it was established almost single-handedly by Luang Pu Mun. During most of his lifetime, however, Luang Pu Mun was relatively unknown. Throughout his monastic life, he shunned fame and status as a pestilent disease. In 1928, while staying at Wat Jedi Luang, one of the oldest and most prestigious monasteries in Chiang Mai, he received a letter from the powers that be in Bangkok informing him of his appointment as the monastery's new abbot. Before long, he had gathered his possessions and disappeared into the mountains. It was another 11 years before he was seen in the city again. Luang Pu Mun could be a fierce and exacting teacher. One of his famous scoldings would, in a senior disciple's memorable phrase, shrivel your liver. But he inspired a quiet and intense devotion from those around him. One layman, whose life had been transformed by his contact with Luang Pu Mun, was then living at Khao Wongkot, and it was he who first spoke of the great master to Luang Por. Apparently, Luang Pu Mun had finally returned to Isan after so many years of solitary wandering in the north of the country, and a large group of monks had gathered around him in the Phu Pan mountains of northern Isan. Monks of the Mahanikai lineage were also receiving teachings. Luang Por's plans for the cold season began to take shape. At the end of the retreat, Luang Por, together with 3 other monks, a novice and 2 laymen, set off on the long walk back to Isan. They broke their journey at Ban Ko, and after a few days' rest, began the 240-kilometer hike northwards. By the 10th day, they had reached the elegant white stupa of That Panom, a revered pilgrimage spot on the banks of the Mekong, and they paid homage to the Buddha's relics enshrined within it. They continued their walk in stages, regularly finding forest monasteries along the way in which to spend the night. Even so, it was an arduous trek, and the novice and one of the laymen asked to turn back. The group consisted of just 3 monks and a layman when they finally arrived at Wat Pa Nong Pu, the home of Luang Pu Mun. As they walked into the monastery, Luang Por was immediately struck by its tranquil and secluded atmosphere. The central area, in which stood a small raised wooden Dhamma hall, was immaculately swept, and the few monks they caught sight of were attending to their daily chores silently, with a measured and composed gracefulness. There was something about the monastery that was like no other that he had been in before. The silence was strangely charged and vibrant. Luang Por and his companions were received politely, and after being advised where to put up their glots, took a welcome opportunity to bathe away the grime of the road. Luang Por was never to speak in any great detail about this first meeting, which was to have such a monumental effect on his life. But for monks who have lived in the forest monasteries of Isan, it is a scene easy to imagine. The 3 young monks may be pictured, with their double-layered outer robes folded neatly over their left shoulder, minds fluctuating between keen anticipation and cold fear, making their way through the gathering dusk to the wooden Dhamma hall to pay respects to Luang Pu Mun. As he approaches the congregation of resident monks, Luang Por starts to crawl on his knees towards the Great Master. He approaches a slight and aged figure with an indomitable diamond-like presence. Luang Pu Mun's deeply penetrating gaze bears into Luang Por as he bows 3 times and sits down at an appropriate distance. Most of the resident monks are sitting with eyes closed in meditation, one slightly behind the teacher, slowly fanning away the evening's mosquitoes. As Luang Por glances up, he notices how prominently Luang Pu Mun's collarbone juts through the pale skin above his robe, and how his thin mouth, stained red from chewing betel nut, forms such an arresting contrast to the strange luminosity of his presence. As is the time-honored custom amongst Buddhist monks, Luang Pu Mun first asks the visitors how long they have been in robes, the monasteries they have practiced in, and the details of their journey. Did they have any doubts about the practice? Luang Por replies that he does. It is at this point that he was later to take up the story himself. He said that he had been studying the Vinaya texts with great enthusiasm, but had become discouraged. The disciplines seemed too detailed to be practical. It didn't seem possible to keep every single rule. What should one's standard be? Luang Pu Mun listened in silence. Then he gave simple but practical advice. He advised Luang Por to take the 2 guardians of the world, wise shame, in Pali hiri, and wise fear of the consequences, ottappa, as his basic principles. In the presence of these 2 virtues, he said, everything else would follow. He then began to discourse on the 3-fold training of Sila, Samadhi and Panya, the 4 roads to success and the 5 spiritual powers. Eyes half closed, His voice became progressively stronger and faster as he proceeded, as if he was moving into a higher and higher gear. With absolute authority, he described the way things truly are and the path to liberation. Luang Por and his companions sat completely enwrapped. Luang Por said that although he had spent an exhausting day on the road, listening to Luang Por Mun's Dhamma talk made all of his weariness disappear. His mind became lucidly calm and clear, and he felt as if he was floating in the air above his seat. It was late at night before Luang Por Mun called the meeting to an end, and Luang Por returned to his glot, aglow. The usual translation of the Thai word sangop is peace, and this is correct in most contexts. But when dealing with the practice of meditation, Luang Por uses the word sangop in ways that can sometimes make this translation problematic. For this reason, in the meditation context, it has sometimes been rendered with the unorthodox translation, lucid calm. On the second night, Luang Por Mun gave more teachings, and Luang Por felt that he had come to the end of his doubts about the practice that lay ahead. He felt a joy and rapture in the Dhamma that he had never known before. Now what remained was for him to put his knowledge into practice. Indeed, one of the teachings that had inspired him the most on those 2 evenings was this injunction to make himself a witness to the truth. But the most clarifying explanation, one that gave him the necessary context or basis for practice that he had hitherto been lacking, was of a distinction between the mind itself and transient states of mind which arose and passed away within it. Luang Por Mun said they're merely states. Through not understanding that point, we take them to be real, to be the mind itself. In fact, they're all just transient states. As soon as he said that, things suddenly became clear. Suppose there's happiness present in the mind. It's a different kind of thing. It's on a different level to the mind itself. If you see that, then you can stop. You can put things down. When conventional realities are seen for what they are, then it's ultimate truth. Most people lump everything together as the mind itself, but actually there are states of mind together with the knowing of them. If you understand that point, then there's not a lot to do. On the third day, Luang Por paid his respects to Luang Por Mun and led his small group off into the lonely forests of Phupan once more. He left Nong Phuon never to return again, but with his heart full of an inspiration that would stay with him for the rest of his life.